Hello and welcome back to my channel What If Deku 2.0. Join us as we delve into the realms of fanfiction and fantasy, bringing you the best stories and discussions. Today, we're kicking off part 2 of our series, What If Hacker Deku Joined League of Villains? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is AuthorRei from Archive of Our Own. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. Nezu brought his paws in front of his stomach. I see. You must have been the one digging into our teacher records. He nodded, inclining his head slightly. I'm glad that you know my signature, Nezu. But I'm not here for teacher records this time. The principal nodded. You're quite interested in the students, yes. Trying to stay calm, Deku continued on, risking looking away and back to the class. The one I want isn't here. I don't believe you transferred him to 1B, so I would like to know where he is. Izumura, Nezu nodded. No, you will not find him here. Our records say nothing of him being a virtual learner, do they? If they were updated today, I have yet to check. Now are you going to try and stall for the teachers to arrive, or can I just kill you? To emphasize his point, he stood, yanking out his knife. It wasn't much, but neither was the principal. The animal would be dead before any pros could arrive. It was a nice attempt, but physical violence isn't your style. I believe we both know that, Deku, Nezu said calmly. I've never even heard of you setting a villain on a hero before. But there are plenty of villain attacks where you have alerted heroes in the vicinity, before anyone could get there first. Dropping down to the ground, inside Yue's walls, Deku hefted his knife. Maybe I have. So what does that matter? You don't want to see people hurt, Deku. We both know this. He shifted uncomfortably, taking a small step forward, hoping that he at least appeared confident, at best mildly threatening. I want what my clients want. Nezu held out his paw. We both know you wouldn't be here if that was all you wanted. Come with me. We can talk about this. That was what he was looking for. Izumura took a step backwards, setting a hand on the wall. His climbing gear was still on, so he could scale the wall relatively easily. You just want to arrest me, he spat. I know your type. Lure people in with false promises and sweet lies. Well, I won't fall for it. You heroes are all the same. For that you should be exterminated. He began climbing, turning away for a split second so he could properly get on top. When he turned back, he saw Nezu just shaking his head. It's really a pity I couldn't change your mind. Will you be back? If you have the money, I will be. You know how to reach me. What information do you want, Nezu? He was turned away now, looking off into the forest, to give the impression that he wasn't interested. Still, he had his hand on his knife and crouched on the top of the wall, ready to jump when the situation called for it. Why must you assume that everyone only wants something from you? His voice was soft and mournful now. For a moment, Deku let himself believe that the hero cared. Water began to well up in his eyes, so unused to how delicately they were speaking to him. Even if it was from an animal, a genetic abnormality, he didn't realize words could sound so sad. No, that's enough. They're a hero. They will stab you in the back if given the chance. Shaking off the sudden swell of emotion, he forced his thoughts down behind a carefully crafted icy exterior. That's how the world works, principle. It always has. Carefully, he jumped down to the ground, swiftly taking off into the forest. On complete impulse, he dropped one of his flash drives into the dirt. He had wasted too much time already, but maybe what he downloaded onto it would be enough to convince them to leave him alone. It was nothing too precious, worth, at least, not much to him, but it might be valuable for them if they knew what kind of information he was collecting. They still knew nothing about him, and he was going to keep it that way, whether they worked with him or not. There were no footsteps behind him, but still he ran through the trees, putting his knife away but still keeping a hand on his phone, stopping every couple of minutes to hack cameras nearest to him. He even broke into hero comms, but there was no chatter about his appearance. It seemed that Nezu hadn't mentioned anything, nor even told the teachers. Could he really trust the principal? His first instinct told him of course not. Heroes existed to protect civilians, yes, but nothing more. The moment they encountered someone else, someone without any extraordinary talents, they cast them aside as if they were worth less than the first they walked on. Not one hero would risk their life to knowingly rescue a quirkless kid. Deku knew that. For a while, at least, he was okay with it. He bought into the belief that he really was useless, that his life had no meaning, and that he would be better off dead than in a world where nobody wanted him. There was a time, just before the League, right when his mother first fell ill, that he might have jumped off the roof. He might have actually been another victim of Hero Society. Now, though, he wasn't so sure. It was concerning how a conversation with a hero, just one that was even the slightest bit kind to him, was able to shake the foundations of his entire moral code. They were barely even a hero, just a mutated rat who happened to have the intelligence of a human. Or was he a bear? Nobody really could tell. Either way, as he made his journey back into town, walking through the high vigilante traffic areas, he made sure to watch his back, check that he hadn't been followed, and make sure no tracers were planted on him. Nezu was far smarter than he was, after all, but if Deku didn't want to be found, he couldn't be. There was nothing to worry about. Unless Nezu connected Deku to Izumura. That would be far more than just a small issue. But, for now, as Deku traversed his way through the dark alleys and short tunnels that kept people who were hiding from the law undetected, he decided to check his phone for any potential messages from clients. Unsurprisingly, there was one waiting for him. "Come back to UA for a chat. It might be worth your while." Of course, Deku responded immediately. "I'm not interested in becoming a hero, Nezu. Not hero work. You have some skills that I'm interested in. I can pay you 60,000 yen for the first meeting. An hour is all I ask for." Somehow, he found himself considering it. "When do you want me there?" "As soon as is convenient. I will be waiting." His phone rang as he was messaging back and forth with the principal, so he picked it up. The caller ID was from Kurogiri, anyway. "You've been out for several hours already, Izumura," he began, worried as always. "Is everything all right?" Jumping over a couple trash bins, Deku made one last check behind him. "I'm good, Kurogiri. Going to head to that vigilante cafe I discovered a few weeks back. They're quiet about their customers, so I'm not too worried about being discovered. That being said, I'll send you the address to the place so you can warp me out if things get dicey." There was a loud, heavy sigh on the other end of the phone. "And you're sure I can't change your mind?" "I'm sure. It's called Airway, if you're wondering. They take privacy to the extremes there, so you shouldn't worry about being discovered. I'll give you a call as soon as I get what I need." "The raid's in 2 days," he heard Tamura scowl. "Don't get caught and blow the whole thing." "Chill, Shigaraki," Deku said, brushing past the wire fence that led to the cafe. "I'll be careful. There's someone who might be here anyway. They can give me some good intel. Just don't get caught." There was a small click, and Kurogiri hung up. Deku would have turned his phone off, but access to his quirk was imperative in a situation like this. Right before he entered the cafe, he shot a quick message to the one person he might be able to trust. "Detective Tsukachi, if you would like to speak, I am in Musutafu. You know where." Upon entering the cafe, Deku was immediately prompted by the greeter at the door to keep his mask on at all times, even providing him with another should he need to take his off for any reason. They asked for his name and, unbothered, he gave it. This place had strict rules on the identities of their customers, creating a safe environment where villains, heroes, vigilantes, and cops could all gather in relative peace to exchange information without worrying about their identities. Most heroes came in recognizable clothing, usually their hero costumes, unless they had something to hide. Villains almost always came in disguise, masquerading as another villain or going by a different name. Police came in normal clothes, simple full-face masks concealing them. Vigilantes, though, had little to worry about. Most were unknown, and those that were had powerful enough abilities to keep themselves safe. Nobody revealed civilian identities, anyway. He was unknown, at least in person. Virtually, he was well known. In fact, he didn't doubt that everyone there had at least heard of him. Should they hear his name, some might even leave, concerned about him digging into their personal information. His online identity was omnipotent, an online god. Those who knew of him were afraid. He could ruin their life, should he want to. Everyone had skeletons in their closets, him especially. But there was no fun in that. "There might be someone arriving to meet with me," he told the staff. "I'd like to be put somewhere private, if you don't mind." He crossed his arms, slightly inclining his head in their direction. "Things may get interesting." They led him to a small corner of the place, enclosed by glass walls, completely sound isolated from the rest of the cafe. Some of the markings on his suit, though, drew attention to him. Indeed, the rabbit mask must have only cemented some of their thoughts, as he did hear mumbled words of hacker and didn't exist. So it was true. Most of them chose to believe that he didn't exist, rather brushing him off as some kind of urban legend. "Don't act out or Deku will find ya." That must have been what they were whispering about, casting shady glances in his direction. In response, he raised his head high, the piercing green eyes of his mask turning to stare at them in turn. His stature might not be intimidating, he might be somewhat scrawny, in fact, but that didn't change how these people perceived him. Bulky or no, he was at least toned enough to scare some of them, and that was enough. Deku had always been self-conscious, and that didn't change now. Here, though, with a mask to hide behind and a reputation to uphold, there was no option to show weakness or embarrassment. Instead of what he'd usually do, shrinking into himself, tensing, waiting for someone to hit him, he brought his shoulders back, carrying himself with as much confidence as he could muster. His hood was still over his head, which was good, hiding his identity further. He sat for over half an hour in the small room, his laptop open in front of him, waiting. The detective had given no sign that he had even seen the message, but Deku had done his research. There was little chance he hadn't, and even the police were aware of this place. Sukachi would have known exactly what he was talking about. At some point, he pushed his mask to the side, his hood still covering the majority of his face and his back to the glass, breathing easier now that he didn't have something over his nose and mouth. Say what you will about anonymity, but wearing a mask when he was alone seemed pointless. Still, though, he wouldn't be Deku without his usual level of paranoia. Using the cafe's internet, he hacked into their camera feed. Hidden devices planted all around the outside of the building, but none inside to protect secrecy. They had a good standing with all of the city's villains and vigilante groups. Breaching that trust would be a declaration of war. Out of the corner of his eye, though, he watched someone approach, carefully sliding the mask back over his face. The glass door was pulled to the side by one of the employees standing nearby. There was a beat of silence. "You're Deku, I take it?" He breathed out, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. "Yes, I am." His voice changer was working properly, as it had been, but it didn't prevent him from worrying. At some points, he sounded like a woman, others like a man, but for the majority of his sentences, it came out distinctly robotic in nature. It was intimidating, and he designed it exactly for that reason. "Why meet with me now, after ignoring my attempts to contact you?" The detective moved away from the door, the employee softly shutting it, and shifted into Deku's field of view, settling into a chair. "You're a hard person to read." "I have to be, to protect myself," he answered, lifting his head up from his laptop. "My line of work leaves me vulnerable to attack. From all parties." Sukachi set his arms on the table, contemplating. "The heroes would have no reason to attack you had you not sold their information to villains." and they left me no choice but to do so, Deku snapped. I needed money to survive, as everybody else does. I offered my services at first, but they refused me. After all, he turned back to his laptop, an idea popping into his head. Quirkless people have no place in this society. The detective paused. I wasn't aware you were quirkless. Deku glanced back up. Of course not. Nobody expects the Hacker Deku to be naturally quirkless. He leaned his elbows on the table, resting his chin on one of his hands, gesturing with the other. They think my skill comes from something born to me? No. I simply worked hard enough to be useful to this cursed society that decided I was worthless because I don't have a natural-born talent. Sukachi, it seemed, didn't have anything to say to that. My cards are on the table, detective, he continued. I have no physical way to defend myself, yet I have others who are willing to protect me. You know several people who I've had contact with, and you also know that my skills are invaluable to you. So I will ask you. He leaned forward, bringing his other hand under his chin. What do you want from me? Still, the detective seemed reluctant to respond. You've read my emails, yes? Just the first one I responded to. He took the opportunity to lean back in his chair, hoping he gave off a confident air. Didn't think you'd get your hopes up if I didn't reply. While correct, there are a few things that we think you might have an interest in. Reaching into his briefcase, he pulled out several manila envelopes, setting them down on the table carefully. Take a look at these. For obvious reasons, you are unable to take these with you, but I hope that you might be able to make some sense of them. Cautiously, Deku slid the top file towards him, opening it to reveal a couple pages of information. This one was about a drug named Trigger that had recently been exposed to the general public, most notably small-time criminals and thugs. Trigger, he mused aloud. My comrades don't exactly approve of this drug. It causes chaos, but the user lacks the necessary control to make it effective. We don't necessarily want it off the streets, but... I don't care about whoever you're working with, Sukachi interrupted. I just want to know what you want, not whatever they do. Taken aback, Deku sat up a little straighter. Why would that not be what I think? Because you don't seem like that kind of person, Deku, he replied, not unkindly. You're hard to read, but I can tell this. You don't want people hurt. You constantly send heroes to the scenes of violent crimes. Your prices are lowered for heroes looking into physical abuse cases. And despite your affiliations, you don't strike me as a villain. So, he leaned in closer. What do you want? Damn. He was smart, which was exactly why Deku chose to meet with him instead of any other detective, but it worked against him as well. This detective had researched him extensively, probably combed every encounter with the heroes and the few recorded traces from captured villains. I want a reformed society, Deku said shortly. I want proper heroes protecting everyone, and I do mean everyone. There are very few in this world who are too far gone. Like yourself, Sukachi asked quietly. Like myself. He turned his attention back to the file. Anyway, that's not the topic at hand. It's relevant. How so? Another one of the folders suddenly slid to a stop next to his laptop. Overcome by curiosity, he picked it up, examining the small printed words on the outside of the envelope. Missing quirkless child. This may be something you would want to look into, the detective nudged gently. After all, you're Midoriya, aren't you? Deku paused and took a long breath in and out. I was. He turned back to his laptop, opening a new file to take notes. I hope you realize that I'll get all this information later. Clearly recognizing that he wanted nothing to do with the previous line of conversation, the detective didn't object to the change in subject. I assumed as much, but it's better that I speak with you in person regarding this anyway, Midoriya. Midoriya died years ago, Deku said sharply, his whole body tensing up. I would appreciate it if you refrain from calling me that. The man raised his hands placatingly. All right, Deku it is, then. I will go back to my earlier question, Detective. Deku looked back up. What do you want from me, and what do I get out of it? A place to go, Tsukachi said simply. When Deku didn't reply, he continued on. By speaking with you now and from the little contact we have with you, you don't seem much like a person who is doing all of this for fun. You toy with people, yes, but not necessarily in harmful ways. Your contacts seem to mostly be villains, or those who operate outside of the realm of the law, because they are the ones most likely to buy your talents. You also seem to have found a place to camp out without leaving any kind of trace of your whereabouts. I think you're part of a villain's group. Would I be correct in saying that? Deku's mouth went dry. He had nothing to say. And not only that, but they have something on you that doesn't let you leave. I don't know what it is, but you are locked in a bad situation, Deku. And we both know that turning to police or heroes for help would only get you arrested, potentially even killed if the villains you work with are powerful enough, which I don't doubt. Frankly put, Izuku, you have no options. So why tell me things I already know? Deku was raising his voice now, standing up and slamming his palms on the table. So what? I threw my life away because I needed to, and I already had no other options. At least now I actually have a chance to live instead of wondering when my next meal would be or if my mother would die. He picked his hands back up, letting his fingertips rest lightly on the edge of the table. As far as I'm concerned, I have plenty more options now than I ever used to. I'm saying that villainy doesn't have to be your only option, the detective said calmly. Work with me. I am friends with several top heroes. I'm sure we could. I know exactly who you're friends with, Deku spat, curling his hands into fists. And All Might is one of the worst heroes I've ever met. He won't help a quirkless kid, much less a villain. Backing away, he crossed his arms protectively over his chest. You offer me protection. I already have that, and mine is worth much more than yours will ever be. Deku, Tsukachi tried to reason, they will kill you. You can't live like this. I'll look into your damn cases, he promised, barely concealed anger underlying his voice despite how much the device warped his speaking. I'll work with you, and you alone. If you try to bring All Might into this, you can kiss whatever supposed alliance you have with me goodbye. Good day, Detective. He seized his laptop, slamming the cover shut, and hugged it to his chest. I will contact you when I have the information. Until then, leave me alone. The door was thrown open, and he was about to step out when Tsukachi spoke up behind him. Your mother misses you. That gave him pause, but only for a moment. I know. He stepped away, ignoring the looks from the rest of the people sitting in the cafe, and made his way out the door. The conversation had been a mistake. Finding a place to hide wasn't difficult, but what surprised him the most was when he pushed his mask to the side and found that tears were steadily streaming down his face, collecting in droplets on his chin. Why now? Why, when he hadn't cried in years, was this getting to him so badly? She's fine, he told himself. Mom is fine. It's better that I stay away from her. Telling the detective who he was had been such a mistake. Because of that one small conversation, now his entire world view was turning itself on its head. You're a hacker, he reminded himself, frantically trying to wipe away his tears. You're a mercenary. You can't ever be a hero. Then why was his heart telling him otherwise? Returning to the base weighed on him heavier than usual, almost dragging his feet back through alleys and deserted streets. Most heroes avoided the area, though those that didn't he managed to redirect elsewhere. He was far too tired to even attempt a fight if one of them caught him now. Somehow, his last conversation had completely and utterly drained him, both mentally and physically. He suspected, though, that his tears had worn him out more than he would have otherwise expected. He finally stumbled indoors around midnight, much longer than it should have taken him to return. Despite the hour, Kurogiri was awake, sweeping the same area that Deku swore he cleaned 5 times a day. Clearly sensing his fatigue, he did not comment and allowed Deku to retreat to his room, passing past the closed door to Tamura's bedroom. Once in his office, the door shut securely behind him. He sagged against the wall, like a puppet who had lost its strings, before collapsing in the chair at his desk. That conversation had been a total mistake, but the damned detective had a truth quirk. He couldn't have actually lied to him in a situation like that. He was just barely lucky enough to not be lying about having a natural-born talent. Taking a deep breath, Deku turned on his monitors. If anything, his work would give him some distraction, and there were some emails that he hadn't responded to anyway. Maybe some new clients, some other people, would want information, hopefully some that he had already obtained. If not, he could find it on his own. And, as if to counter the detective's words, he wanted people in his corner who could fight for him if necessary. His standard green icon appeared on his screen, a small loading bar appearing underneath it and disappearing just as quickly. As he thought, there were several messages that he hadn't read. Some might have been from heroes, and others were from villains doubting his credibility, but wanting his work all the same. But one above all the others stood out to him. This one was from a user named Originat0R. I'm not going to start with flattery, as you've shown time and time again that it doesn't work on you. I'm looking for information on high-ranking heroes. I will take as much as I can afford. If your prices are low enough, I need family life, relatives, anything else you can give me. They need to go down, as I'm sure you would agree. Others, lower ranking with information more readily available, I can get on my own time. But the top heroes are the worst of them. I hope we have a deal, Deku. I would rather start the reformation of society sooner rather than later, when the heroes run it into the ground. I'm certain you've at least heard of me, so I'll leave it up to you. I will be in Musutafu for 3 days. You have until then if you want to meet in person. The email was sent yesterday, so he still had time. All right, hero killer. Don't bother telling me where. I'll find you. There was no response, which he expected, finding himself back on the rooftops of Musutafu for the second time that week. His phone was pulled up in front of him, flipping through camera screens as fast as his brain could process them. Stain knew him, and probably knew his talents, too. Remaining near an open security cam was risky, but it would make it easy for Deku to find. On the other hand, if he knew Stain, and he did quite well, the man would want to test his own abilities before meeting with him directly. If Deku could track him down, only then would he be worthy of notice. Even if he had reached out directly, he needed proof. After all, there were a lot of Deku copycats out there. Of course, Deku was more than willing to show off a little. In one of his cameras, he caught a bit of unnatural movement, like someone hiding. There, that was his target. Contrary to popular belief, Deku was actually pretty athletic, even managing a building jump once or twice on his own, most with the assistance of his tactical gear. The hero killer generally avoided the streets, unless he was hero hunting. This camera was placed pretty high up on a rooftop, so it seemed as if Stain was looking for him, as well. He hadn't expected Stain to be as out in the open, but if he was more inclined to get caught, that was his decision. Now, Deku himself was extremely careful. Of his 2 years properly active, only the last couple months had he deemed the risk worth enough to venture outside of his office, outside with the real villains, where the real threat was. After all, nobody would take Deku seriously if his threats couldn't be followed through. The one group that tried to screw him over knew that readily enough. Instead of continuing on, he perched on top of a rooftop, adjusting his mask and double-checking the sensors, patiently running through a few small tests. Here was close enough. All he had to do was wait. Your skills are better than I expected. Greetings to you as well, hero killer. He stood, a hand going to his belt, but did not turn around. I suppose now is when we make the deal. No falling short, I will warn you. I wouldn't dream of it, Deku. Your goals align with mine. It is in our best interests to work together. Deku twirled the flash drive in between his fingers, turning to face Stain, lowering the phone to his side. So, a partnership. The hero killer gave a slight nod. Though I have a feeling that just a partnership won't satisfy your curiosity. You assume correctly. People often told Deku that he had a very eloquent way of speaking, should he ever meet in person. It was unbecoming of a villain, or so they claimed. He simply considered it as part of the flair, part of the fun. More people expected a thug to be a villain than a soft-spoken, educated teenager. He did not elaborate, nor did Stain prompt him to. Instead, the hero killer commented, "This place is far too open. We should not be out like this, especially not you." Raising his head high, Deku stared back into Red Eyes. "I think I can handle myself quite well, thank you." "If that were the case, you would be out a lot more often, Deku." Stain still gestured away from the rooftop. "I do not enjoy hiding out inside buildings, but you picked this place well. There are nothing but abandoned apartments underneath our feet." Drawing his knife to fiddle with something other than the taunting flash drive, Deku stared out across the city, keeping the phone easy to reach should he need to use his quirk. "I need to know the best places to hide, one vigilante to another. Police would be all too eager to have our heads if we were caught." In response, the hero killer strode over to the edge of the roof, looking down over the alleyway below. Deku waited, and the man jumped. Below, he could hear the clatter of a fire escape as Stain landed, and followed him only after a short moment of consideration. If he landed wrong, after all, a broken ankle could mean death if he was caught. Though, he refused to let his own resolve be questioned. "I almost didn't think you would go for the jump," Stain told him once they were both securely on the ground, sliding one of his own knives away. Hacker types don't exactly have much in the physical physique. "Wow," Deku grumbled, really laying on the flattery. "Yeah?" "I meant it. You impress me." Izumura could feel his cheeks start to warm, so he hastily changed the subject. "Regardless, what information are you looking for?" This conversation, though helpful in the long run, was starting to grate on his nerves just the tiniest bit. Most of his talks with people were not in a verbal dance, skillfully trying to pry as much information out of the other person as possible. Quite simply, everything about them told him what he wanted to know, things that he was quickly able to put into his notes to be sold a bit later. Stain knew his most common tricks, something he hadn't quite anticipated when facing a villain who rarely spoke to others, as far as his knowledge went. "Do you catalog information on violent offenders?" Deku nodded. "I keep my information quite well organized. If it's something you're looking for, I offer broad information on heroes, unless you're looking for specifics." This really was infuriating. Without specifics, he would not be able to satisfy the client. Rarely would this turn out well until he started pressing for information. "I'm looking into Endeavor." "Oh, a bold choice. I didn't realize killing top heroes was your style." Scowling, Stain turned away. "It's not. Not yet. He is far too well protected to get through on my own. Maybe, should I have an army, but it is not his time yet." Almost angrily, he kicked at a small rock on the ground. "Genist and Hawks, for now, are fine. I can live with those false heroes while the others fall." "So, you propose a partnership, then refuse to tell me the information you're after." "Implying certain heroes would imply cities, Deku. I choose not to be tracked that easily." He lowered his hand, where it had been resting on the hilt of one of his hands, reaching into a pocket. Deku watched him with careful eyes, ready to contact Kirigiri should the time call for it, his hand resting lightly on the screen of his phone. "I have here a list. Open it when you return to your base. For now, I will take the general information on your definition of the worst heroes." He threw the pocketbook to Deku, who caught it smoothly. The flash drive that he had been throwing up and down was caught and also tossed to the hero killer. "I'll look into it." The hero killer raised an eyebrow. "I was expecting you to ask for payment." "I've already been paid." He raised the pocketbook, slowly flipping through it. "You take notes too, Chizome Akaguro." The man froze. You are more dangerous than I anticipated. People tend to underestimate me. That's what makes me effective. Nodding slowly, a deep chuckle escaped Stain. I should have known. Well then, Deku, it's been a pleasure to meet you. Izumura, Deku said smoothly. My name is Izumura. Izumura, Stain repeated, tasting the name on his tongue. It's a pleasure. With that, he jumped away, leaping up the fire escape and climbing past windowsills. For a moment, he lingered on the edge of a rooftop, the cape softly fluttering in the nightly wind, and then he was gone. Deku, too, waited for a moment, glancing about, before he left out of the back of the alleyway, making sure his mask was securely fastened before he continued his way down the street, giving small nods to known villains and hiding from the occasional hero, not that they recognized him. It was late, and there were little people on the streets, but still. There was a cafe he wanted to visit. He returned to the Airway Cafe, giving a murmured greeting to the employees inside. Each wore something covering their identity, but the uniform was distinct. Even this place was sparsely populated, most of the tables empty, and there was no one there he felt like speaking to. With nothing else better to do, he settled in at a table and pulled out his laptop to get a little bit of work done and to secure some information about the upcoming raid, which, now that he checked the time, he realized was in approximately 12 hours. There was absolutely no way he would miss that, no matter how little sleep he got or how much information he had. Of course, he knew enough to know that All Might would quite easily beat their Namu, but he kept that information to himself. They didn't pay him to tell them if their creations would work or not. After following up with and subsequently ignoring some clients who wanted more than what they paid for, he ordered a small bit of food to munch on and, choosing to give in to his sweet tooth, ordered a piece of cake with his bowl of katsudon. He was finishing up his food, the cake, for the time being, untouched, when someone else slid into the seat across from him. Almost immediately, he lowered the mask back over his face, covering his mouth. It was lucky enough that his sensors alerted him to someone approaching, giving him enough time to react. He glanced up, and his body froze. Good evening, Deku. Across from his booth, he sidled into the seat. I should have expected to see you here. Somehow, Deku managed to find his voice, pausing for only a moment to make sure his voice changer was working properly. The scanner was running as quickly as he could manage. Eraserhead. His voice warped, near identical to how it had sounded in class, and the hero's eyes narrowed in sudden suspicion. I am mildly impressed that you knew who I was. I don't often show my face around here. You forget, the hero murmured quietly, keeping his voice low. Yua has many security systems. I'm well aware I was caught on camera. Your class is quite interesting. Yes, Eraserhead was smart, and dangerously so. Meeting in person with him was one of the worst decisions he could have made. Should he need to get a message to Kurogiri without his quirk, he would be hard-pressed to send the text without garnering suspicion. Wait, what did he care about a hero knowing that a villain was texting someone? It wasn't like that was cause to attack him for sending a text. He still didn't send it. Eraser's mouth tightened into a thin line. So you have been watching. It's my job, he explained simply. And speaking of which, were you aware that your principal offered me one? God. Deku loved poking at people, waiting for them to grow impatient and snappy. He was basically an internet troll in the flesh. The hero clenched his jaw. Nezu informed me. That does not mean I agree with it. Why not? His voice was light and playful. The way I see it, hero, my work is incredibly beneficial to you all. Why do you not trust me? Because, he lowered his voice further, eyes flashing with a deeply concealed rage, I have contacted you before, and you sold information to me without a second thought. Grinning softly, Deku recalled the conversation. He knew right away that it was Eraser just by how he spoke. Oh, I know. The smallest bit of anger seemed to melt off of Eraserhead's face, and just that was a stretch. Deku was good at reading facial expressions, but underground heroes got special training to hide how they were feeling. If Eraser wasn't one of his favorite heroes, he probably wouldn't even be able to tell. I know everything that goes on with my clients. And your username was something about cats, right? Deku leaned in closer. I know everyone I sell to, Eraserhead. You'd be surprised by what I'm able to find. And it was true. Those people that he never responded to were those he didn't believe would be able to pay, or the ones that he deemed too dangerous to obtain such intel. He was no idiot. He knew what he was doing. Falling silent for a moment, Eraser's eyes flashed a darker shade of red as his quirk activated. Don't you even think about trying anything. I don't have a quirk, he said delicately, only then noticing that he had a hand perched on his laptop. So it doesn't matter if you use yours, and it's neutral ground here. Hero, if you attack me here, you declare war. The hero was definitely aware of this. He could not spend his days traversing the underworld, the darker side of humanity, for him to not recognize it. The black market, an underground, digital organization, was part of his domain. It was Deku's as well, and there were many places they both knew about. If this place violated the peace, there would be no stopping the hell that the villains would rain down on them. Deku delighted in watching Eraser's expression, carefully pinging his emotions. Frustration was the most evident, then anger, followed by an attempt at calming himself down. So what did you want from me? Answers. I may or may not give them. Eraser. I want to know what your intentions are at UA. You would not have accepted that job without a reason. You don't do anything without a reason. Leaning back in his chair, Deku looked away, giving the impression that he was considering an answer. Maybe I just wanted a way to work with heroes without arrest warrants being issued with my name on it. Villains get warrants, Deku. I'm doing a job, he replied simply, careful to not let anger bleed into his voice. I just don't really mind who I sell to. Eraser opened his mouth, and before the hero could say anything else he raised his tone. And I'm tired of explaining this to every single person that I meet. This is enough. I've spoken to All Might, to your detectives, to Nezu. I'm tired of it. No matter how noble your cause. No, Deku got to his feet and slammed his hands down. You treat me like a child who doesn't know right from wrong. I am well aware of what I'm doing. I know that this is wrong, Eraser, and I've made my peace with that. I'm not doing this for money, or for fame, or any other damn reason that normal villains wreak havoc. I don't want to take down Hero Society. I want to prove that there's something wrong with it. Hero doesn't mean the same thing it did when the commission was established, which, by the way, is rotten to the core, which I'm sure you already know. As much as I hate All Might, as much as heroes like Endeavor make me want to vomit, I don't want to uproot this society from its very core. Do you even know what kind of work I do? I sell the information of heroes that I disagree with, or have committed a crime that they have not been prosecuted for. I sell this information to villains with the capacity to get rid of them, and even if they don't, I still get paid. I sell to the news, so they can spread the information and ruin a hero's career, or to people who can actually do something about it. And don't forget, with how dangerous some of these villains are, I will give information to heroes as well. I don't charge them, or at least I didn't, depending on what they wanted from me. His voice had risen far above normal speaking volume. It was surprising enough that the employees had not already asked him to keep it down. You heroes act like you're so high and mighty, yet none of you will go help the people who actually need it when it counts. What about the kids who just lost their parents? Or maybe someone who lost their job and now doesn't have a home to go back to? I help people through the way I know how, by getting rid of those who don't do their jobs the way they're meant to. That's exactly why I despise you, and All Might, and all you damn teachers that don't know how to make real heroes, and those that don't just rely only on their power. Still, nobody came to quiet him. Most likely, it was the fear. Fear of villains and high-strung vigilantes with temper control issues kept them at bay and civil. as if their very lives depended on it. Perhaps, sometimes, they did. Whatever the case, there was no reply. Bowing his head, Deku quietly began picking up his things, sliding cables into place on his belt and flash drives into his pockets. I do apologize. That was out of line. And it was. Deku wasn't supposed to be violent. Deku had no need to be. For the moment, the hero seemed too stunned to speak. While Eraser was gathering his thoughts, Deku picked up his laptop, quickly doing a mental sweep of the area to ensure it was clear before he sent any messages to Kurogiri. Then, in a quiet voice, Eraser spoke. Hero Society failed you. No shit. But that doesn't mean it can't be changed. It's already too late for me. I'm as good as dead, no matter what you try to pull. He took a step backwards. But thank you, Amakbo, for your consideration. Aizawa stood up as well. We're not done here. Yes, we are, he countered, dropping a few bills next to his untouched cake. Deku casted a longing look before turning the other way. Meeting with dangerous people in cafes needed to stop. Immediately. 2 was already far too much. Before he could move very far, a hand caught his wrist. Deku. We are not done here. Wrenching his arm away, Deku glanced back, taking another few steps away. Don't touch me. Kid, I told you that. You're not getting anything from me. As stealthily as he could, he dove into cyberspace for half a second, giving himself enough time to type out a message and location for Kurogiri. Thankfully, Eraser didn't seem to notice. Keep your hands off me. An employee appeared just to his right. Sir, the cafe. This is not an arrest, Eraserhead said exasperatedly. Be that as it may, our policy is peace, no matter the background. Start a fight, and you will be thrown out. A strong-looking man took a stand just over his shoulder, tilting his head almost threateningly from side to side. Surely recognizing that this was a bad decision, Eraserhead backed off, raising his hands, palms out. All right. I didn't mean anything by it. Make sure it doesn't happen again, Deku voiced. I have friends in high places. Leave me alone. A clear threat. He didn't make many of those. Most of his words only implied violence. As much as he liked this hero, or at least how he operated, this little exchange had him bristling and on edge. It had been a while since something had riled him up so badly. Probably not since someone tried to skimp out on their deal. Leave my students alone, and stop selling information on heroes. I will leave you alone after that. Deku laughed, a dark and evil, menacing thing, something that made even Tamura shiver. Now, if I was going to do that, I would have stopped after the first sale. With that, he turned his back, trusting those behind him to keep the hero at bay. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he yanked it out, checking the message. Kurogiri was ready. The familiar void that he was now so used to appeared out of nothing, crawling out of a crack in the fabric of the universe. It started off small, a seemingly purple flame, growing into a large fog that surrounded him within seconds. I'll be seeing you, Eraserhead. And he was tugged through the gate, a calm, cool feeling washing over him as he passed through time and space itself, emerging on the other side in the main room of the bar. A breath of relief passed through his lips, and he allowed his shoulders to slump. Thanks for the save, Kurogiri. I don't think I'd have been able to keep that up much longer. Keep going with your streak and you'll end up arrested, Tamura grumbled from the bar, some kind of smoothie on the smooth wooden surface in front of him. Don't get into those situations when you've got shit to do. Removing his mask, Deku sauntered over to the counter, setting his things down as gingerly as possible. I didn't get arrested, though, did I? We're going to kill All Might tomorrow, came the response, if they know you're involved. It's my public declaration as a villain, I know. Izumura rolled his eyes. As long as All Might's dead, I really don't care. I'll deal with the consequences. Is everyone ready to go for tomorrow? I thought that was your job. I don't see it in my contract. You know what I mean. Grinning softly, Deku replied, "Do I?" Shigaraki groaned. "You're a pain in the ass." "Thank you." He picked up his laptop, ignoring everything else, and backed away. "I'm headed to my room now. Get your shit done before tomorrow." "It's all done. Bring me along. I can't miss this." Maybe after the incident with Aizawa, it would be wiser to stay far away, especially if he couldn't use his quirk and monitor for any approaching heroes. Not only that, but if he was unlucky, the villain in charge of jamming their systems would jam his own too, and leave him nearly defenseless. However, Deku knew his worth. All for One needed him in the picture. He wouldn't allow Deku to be captured so easily, not that it would be. With Shigaraki, Kirigiri, and Namu around, the heroes would have a hard time getting close enough to grab him. Not only that, but they were above using hostages. There was no threat, provided they didn't choose to execute him on the spot, which was unlikely, especially if they became aware of his age. Retreating to his room, he quietly shut the door, turning the small lock to give himself some privacy. It was quiet, almost too much so. Soundproof paneling lined the walls, keeping noises both in and out. Things were strewn across his chaotically messy desk, the only neat thing being the notebooks, all 19 of them, stacked up in the corner of his desk. He was almost done with the 19th full of a compiled list of the quirks and weaknesses of the latest batch of lackeys he had to analyze, and there was a spare notebook or two sitting under his bed already. There were clients he needed to reach out to, emails he needed to respond to, but he ignored all of that in favor of turning on some soft music and completely collapsing on his bed, like a puppet that had lost its strings. He had been sleep-deprived enough for this. Late nights and early mornings had not done him well. Maybe that was the reason he's been actively and inadvertently seeking out the heroes. His judgment has been too impaired. Izumura would have to fix that before it got him killed. Deku didn't bother to change out of his suit, aside from unbuckling the belt with his flash drives and other slightly fragile equipment. There had been much headache and every ounce of skill poured into procuring the information on them, and he would be damned if that meant they were destroyed. The security systems had been upgraded recently, and he really didn't want to bother breaking back in just to replace something he accidentally broke. The music dulled his senses, filling his ears, nestling into his brain. He closed his eyes, allowing it to completely block all other thoughts and to remove his stressors. It was late, and he was tired, so his body was easily able to relax and slump bonelessly down into the cushions. Izumura couldn't be bothered to pick up a pillow to use, instead curling up right on top of the comforter. It was only when he realized that sound wasn't reaching his ears that he woke. Kirigiri was lingering by his computer, hand hovering over the keyboard. The 12-hour music playlist that Deku had painstakingly gathered had just been paused. "I'm a little surprised that turning this off was all it took to wake you." "How'd you get in my room?" he demanded, sitting up quickly. Deku was sure he looked like a mess, with tangled green hair and crumpled clothes. "I'm sure I locked the door." "Locks are not an issue for me," came the answer. "It is time." An hour later, he was fully geared up and stepping into an open warp gate. His phone was clenched tightly in his hand underneath specially designed gloves, barely making contact with the screen. His laptop had not been taken because of the bulk. The helmet over his head concealed who he was, but Aizawa would know instantly. The students would learn of the Hacker Deku, Kachon especially. And if Izuku Midoriya's identity got leaked, he had died once. He could do it again. Kachon was the first to catch his eye. The hero costume was almost exactly as he had designed when they were kids. Aside from a couple of hardly noticeable changes, his ideas were right there, in plain sight, painted for everyone to see. Was it just because he couldn't come up with anything better, or that he felt guilty over Izuku's supposed suicide? It looked as if the costume makers had even used his blueprints. The ones painstakingly planned out his backup plans as a support gear designer if his hero dream didn't work out. Even from a young age, he was already making backups. As far as the League knew, though, he didn't have a second plan. Not for this. There was something they hadn't accounted for in their original idea, All Might not showing up. Which, if they asked, Deku could have told them. His self-destructive tendencies left room for little else. Apparently, no matter how much All for One claimed to know about All Might, he did not know about the supposed time limit that the man had with his abilities. Though Deku had about the same amount of information, he knew enough to know that All Might rarely turned down a good fight. Exceptions applied. The incident with himself didn't end up provoking the hero into revealing his civilian identity. The hero probably used up his time for the day, and couldn't risk being seen around his students, not that he even mentioned the possibility to Shigaraki. It would ruin his own plans, and he wouldn't listen anyway. "He's not here," Deku muttered quietly, not even sure if the message was intended to be heard. Probably won't be. There seemed to be some minor discussions between the students, Aizawa giving muttered orders that he couldn't hear unless... Oh, right. Finally, for that morning, he logged online. Tapping the side of his helmet, he linked himself to the earpieces that he had known they had been given. Don't do anything stupid. These are real villains. With the communication jammer in place, attempting to actively help them over the line would prove disastrous once they all got half a brain in their head. He wasn't entirely sure how he could reach them while they couldn't, but it was best not to open his mouth and help. All they needed to do, as far as Shigaraki was concerned, was put on a bit of a show, kill a few students, kill All Might, and then leave. For the others, the thugs and what else that All for One hired, they could let loose as they pleased as long as All Might died. Deku was not going to let that happen. Villain or not, he didn't like killing, and he had made certain that the others knew that they were not to kill those here or they'd risk his wrath. Even he saw it necessary, sometimes maybe for a certain blonde-haired student, but the others were innocent, as far as he knew. He would not stand by and watch as children were murdered. He ignored the part of himself that was still a child too. "There's only a few of them," Bakugo spoke through his earpiece as he ignored the words of his fellow villains. "We can take 'em." Deku couldn't stop his laugh. It started as nothing more than a snort, then built up into a full-on cackle, ringing through his helmet, echoing across the bounds of the Aste. The heroes stiffened at the sound, and several of the students shrunk away. His laugh slowly died down to little more than a chuckle. "Oh, you sweet, naive students, how insignificant we must seem to you." A little toying around with them, though, would not be out of place. Eraserhead already knew who he was, and he wanted to have some fun. "Remain back here," Aizawa's voice cut into his ear. "That man is very dangerous. You cannot approach. He will kill you if you provoke him." "Please," Bakugo scoffed. "He's just another extra who—" "Deku is dangerous," Aizawa said plainly. Izumura could have laughed again at the sheer look of surprise that passed over Kachan's face. It remained there for only a few seconds, and then it twisted into a scowl. He turned to face Deku, eyes narrowed in pure anger. "Deku, you bastard." His voice was barely a whisper, but Deku could hear the tension. "You bastard!" With that, he lunged, his explosions firing himself into the air. "Well, you've certainly improved your quirk," Deku said calmly, and took a few steps back before he could land. "Kurogiri, please continue as planned." As he spoke, villains stepped through the warp gate behind him, stretched out and ready to attack. Deku prepared himself, quickly drawing his knife in anticipation of Bakugo's attack. But Kurogiri stepped in, as Deku knew he would. Another portal made Kachan land right back where he started, behind the rest of the students and far out of range. The League could not afford to lose him, and definitely not to a mere student. "All Might should be here as well," Kurogiri said to him, collected and level-headed as always. "You knew something about this, didn't you?" "I had my suspicions," Deku answered honestly, but nothing concrete. The heroes in front of them were prepared now. Eraserhead had lowered his specially designed goggles over his face, and 13 had placed herself in front of the students with her hands outstretched. Though the students looked ready to fight themselves, a few as-is were restraining Bakugo and chattering worriedly amongst themselves. Most of them had little practice with their quirks, and didn't compare to the villains who'd spent the last several honing theirs. They stood no chance against Tamura's army, none at all. Eraserhead was an underground hero. He specialized in sneak attacks, attacking one-on-one and vanishing just as quickly. Wide open spaces were not his style, nor was he good at handling multiple opponents when he couldn't keep his eyes on all of them. He was not suited to this kind of fight. Villains escaped the warp gates, spreading out amongst the floor, stalking towards the heroes while keeping their distance, while others scattered to their assigned zones. There, they would lie in wait for the kids to appear. So you scumbags used the press as cover and sneaked onto campus. Eraserhead's shoulders shifted ever so slightly. Tracking his body language closely, Deku set a hand on the phone in his pocket, just in case his quirk was needed. Both Tamura and Aizawa would feed off of the energy each other gave off. They were not a good match. "Where is All Might?" Shigaraki asked. Izumura side-eyed him, at that stupid hand pressed over his face, the one belonging to father. It was the most idiotic thing he could think of. "I brought some friends who can't wait to meet him. Maybe if I kill a couple of kids, he'll come out to play." The statement was enough for Eraser's quirk to activate, and his capture scarf rose up around him, waving intimidatingly. It was the small part of his quirk that let them know exactly when he was dangerous, some secondary quirk factor that made items around his head float. Deku knew that he'd find his quirk missing if he tried to use it, but it wasn't suited to this environment. While 13 remained behind with the students, Eraser began his attack in earnest. Without much interest, Deku lazily watched the fight. His helmet recorded all interactions, regardless of whether he was paying attention or not. If he really needed to, he could go back over the footage. The fight didn't seem all that appealing, either. Eraser and the others were on totally different levels. He was an interesting hero, yes, but not enough to gather more information. Especially if he was just going to die here, which was how this encounter was shaping out. This was a complete waste of time. Aizawa was completely outmatched and out of his league. He was a stealth hero, even Tamura knew that much. Fighting out in the open wasn't his style, nor was it to his advantage. Tamura's suggestion, however, was not in the plan. They all knew as much. The villains they had under their command, Deku's command, were not to kill the kids they fought. They only wanted All Might. Though, if one or two were to die along the way, well, it wasn't really on his hands. That's what he told himself, at least, if it would help him sleep better at night, sure. "Kurogiri," he said softly. A small shift in the corner of his vision let him know that the man was paying attention to him. "All Might's mine." Of course, that was the deal. There was no wavering in his voice, but Deku knew it was a lie. They wouldn't let him, the lowly hacker, their mutt, their supposed trump card, kill someone that valuable. Deku knew better than to comment, though. As it was, there was a little voice in the back of his mind that said he wouldn't be able to take someone's life himself. He cried for days the first time his information resulted in someone's death. Taking up the knife himself? Probably not possible. To distract himself, he said, "Make sure you send that one where the strongest of our army is." He pointed. Next to him, the red and white kid, he's also a threat, but keep them separated and in an area where his quirk is of less use. The others are of no consequence. His mind had already started to slip into his analyst mode. The quirks they fought against today were powerful, there was no doubting that. If the kids really knew how to use them, though, that was where the question lay. He only knew of two that would be a major issue. Neither of them would die here. There, across the arena, 13 had stepped in front of the kids, hand raised and quirk ready to activate. "Get out of the way, now." "I'll scatter you across the arena," Kurogiri called threateningly, letting the purple fog that made up his body shoot toward the young heroes. Now, this was the interesting part. How would the children handle their well-picked villains? Well-picked, he mused, was a strong word. Most were low lives, thugs who only knew how to take orders. Their quirks were the only useful thing about them, and even then it didn't grant their sorry existence meaning. Half of them couldn't even use them to their fullest extent, and a few more used drugs to amplify the output they should be able to get if they just worked a little. Deku was, in all meanings of the word, bored. Eraserhead was slowly making his way through the crowd of criminals. 13 was down, already. Eraser was at a disadvantage, there was no denying that, but Tamura underestimated him. He would prevail, and the whole plan would crumble underneath their feet. "Let one of the kids get out," he muttered lowly. "If they alert teachers, All Might will come running. Unless you'd rather I send him a message myself." "He'll take the message as a threat," Tamura returned. "I thought you didn't want to ally yourself." "I'm here, aren't I? I don't give a damn if he takes it as a threat. It is one." With that, he yanked out his phone, settling down on the ground with crossed legs. This would only take a moment, but he would rather not collapse in front of the heroes. Collapse would mean weakness. Weakness meant that they were mortal. Deku was not just a mortal. He existed online. He was knowledge incarnate. Those who knew him feared his name. They whispered it as if the name alone was enough to draw his attention, operated without the use of the internet as if he wouldn't be able to detect their operations. Well, he knew. He watched, he learned, and he waited. And he typed in the number 1 hero's phone number to casually send him a text. All Might Tilda. It went through, despite the blocker. He didn't have the time to celebrate before the text was clicked on, almost instantly. "Deku? The USJ is under attack, like I warned you earlier. I'd get over here if you don't want your students to die." That was enough of a suitable threat. But still, he added more. "Tell your detective friend that he was right about the villains. They're more dangerous than you know. An old friend, should I say, one you know very well." And now, there was nothing more to do but wait. The children had been scattered among their so-called villains. They were too busy to give any notice to their teachers who were being overwhelmed. One student, he noticed, Ida, managed to break out. But it didn't matter. All Might was coming, as were the others. Could they beat them? Well, probably not. But it was enough to give them a good scare if they retreated quickly enough. A villain who could warp into any location, that would definitely make them uneasy. Especially if there happened to be a villain in Tartarus that they cared about. Izumura picked up his phone. He was not about to dive right into cyberspace, not with heroes on the way and no nearby cameras to monitor his own body. Instead, he remained on the surface, getting into the circuits and boards of the little device without going into the internet itself. Keeping his body immobile, especially in such a situation, was idiotic at best and suicidal at worst. Plus, every so often, Eraserhead's gaze would interrupt his work. "We are on our way. The heroes are coming," he voiced aloud, calmly scrolling through his inbox. He had a few new potential clients to sort through. "All Might is with them. I would recommend we get going, but if you think our Namu has a chance—" "The Namu will kill him," Tamura hissed. "That's the whole point of us being here." With a casual shrug, Deku glanced up at Eraserhead. "We wanted All Might, not the entire staff. The thugs you gathered won't be able to take them all down. Add that to the number of heroes in this area, and we may be far out of our league here." His words were not going to sway Tamura, but it was no matter. He was here, All Might was coming, and Tamura was about to get a taste of power getting to his head. Would he get the chance to kill All Might? Probably not. Would All Might die here? Also most likely a no. And as much as Deku wanted to see All Might die, he wasn't stupid. They were far outclassed. He couldn't even remember why he had agreed to this plan. Maybe the heroes knew something that Deku didn't. They certainly seemed to act as if they knew more about him than they were leading on. All Might even didn't seem to be that wary of him anymore, and he didn't like that at all. The heroes shouldn't grow complacent just because he was willing to work with them. Or maybe they were wary and just hiding it well. Either way, he should be more cautious moving forward. All Might will be here? Tamura scowled, a hand digging into the scabs at his neck. That's enough. Our Namu has the power, and I will not waste this chance to kill the boss. It's practically suicide, Deku retorted, but if you're keen on getting yourself killed, I won't bother. Tamura's scowl deepened, turning his attention back to the main fight at hand. You should worry about your own job, Deku. Keep your nose out of things that don't concern you. I thought that was my job, he replied, turning his head as a loud explosion sounded from one of the distant training centers. Kachan was probably having fun over there. And I won't be getting paid if you die, contrary to your belief. Quit being a moron and learn to cut your losses. We haven't lost yet. Maybe, but if they all show up here we will. And I, for one, am not looking forward to the treatment I'd get if I got caught. He slipped his phone into his pocket and stood, turning away from Eraserhead. We've lost already. Kurogiri, I have no reason to be here anyway. Send me back. As expected and frustrating as it was, Kurogiri followed Tamura's lead. Remain a few minutes, Deku. If we truly do not need you, then there is no harm in you staying. I don't particularly feel like getting caught today, he hissed. Did you not hear me? They will kill us all, and... Boom. He winced, hand going up to the side of his helmet. An alert blared in the side of his vision, attention swiveling to the front doors. He had to smack the side of his head before it shut off. He's here. Distant cheers could be heard from the students that remained helpless and away from their small army of thugs. Even Deku felt his hackles rise at the clearing dust and the shape that was barely visible from the sunlight shining behind them like a beacon. He had forgotten how much hatred surged through himself. Even without looking in Tamura's direction, he could hear the scowl in his voice. All Might. The heroes, he tried again, but Tamura snapped at him. Deku, just shut up. He's here. We don't care about anything else. We can kill him. I thought that was what you wanted? A hand went to scratch at his neck. You know nothing about this. You know nothing. You hacker types are all the same. No strength, no power, nothing. You are worth nothing. Deku had a reputation for not taking insults lying down, but there was nothing he could do here. Even though he knew Tamura and knew how easy it was to get him angry, the words still hurt. Slightly. That's what he let himself believe, anyway. This was just anger, nothing more. It didn't mean anything. He drew himself up. Very well. Slowly, he raised up a hand, waving in the direction of the Namu. Do as you please. I don't care. There was nowhere to run from All Might, and certainly escape was impossible with the heroes on their way. They'd be here in minutes, which was far too soon without any quirks to amplify his agility or speed. Deku was at the mercy of Kurogiri, who would not leave Tamura's side. While some heroes held a more neutral opinion of him, most here did not. Nezu alone likely wouldn't dare vouch for him, despite their correspondence. Eraserhead would kill him willingly. He had led the villains straight to his students, and he had no idea where the rest of the teachers stood on his decisively illegal activities. Despite himself, panic was starting to buzz just underneath his skin. What would he do should he be captured? Surely All for One found him useful enough to break him out of whatever prison they locked him into. But would Tamura, given the outburst just then? He doubted it. And if he was exposed, Deku would be no more. It would just be Izuku Midoriya, the stupid, quirkless kid that went missing a while back. Not only that, but his enemies, those he retaliated against, would know his identity and who his family was. They would target his mom, who he's taken every precaution to keep safe, who he's sent over half of his earnings to in secret to look after herself. Even Kachan's mother, who didn't need any of it, with a message attached to look after her. And she had, even without knowing where or who it came from. But if he was in prison, there was nobody to look after them. All his secrets may be exposed, should he not hide them in time. Surely they couldn't break through his layers and layers of encryptions, But even then it could only be a matter of time with computers on their side. He was, after all, only human. Now he damned himself, moving away when the battle began to rage in earnest. He was of no help here, even checking cameras to see how close the heroes were. Shigaraki wasn't going to listen. Kurogiri wasn't going to listen. The thugs were worthless, and already the student heroes had begun to gather. He couldn't beat them. He wasn't a fighter, wasn't meant to be. He only was here to watch All Might's demise, which was seeming less and less likely as time went on, and the Namu started feeling the hits. "Kurogiri," he called, as another warning. Urgency seeped into his voice. "We need to leave." "Not yet," came the calm reply, and Deku knew they were done for. Eraserhead had fallen as All Might joined them, and his quirk now had no obstructions. He caught a glimpse of a large explosion, close by, and a distant scream. The students had beaten their villains. "They're right on top of us. Shigaraki, get your head out of the clouds, and let's go. We can't fight them. Our Namu can't handle All Might. What makes you think we can?" Sense didn't reach him. It never did. Even during the moments they barely tolerated each other, it would end in an argument within moments. His ego would get them all in trouble, no matter how much fighting power his quirk had. It wasn't polished or trained well. He might be able to take down a few people, but it wouldn't work well against large groups. Deku could fight, but as far as skills went he was essentially quirkless. The best thing he could do to avoid injury was surrender. It only took another few seconds for the heroes to show up. Deku stayed quiet, tapping the side of his helmet, as if fixing an earpiece. The majority of them would recognize him as a mercenary. He was not a physical threat, but those standing by him were. Bullets flew in their direction. Deku had enough sense to back up preemptively, but Tamura had no such luck. He was lucky enough to have Kurogiri step in before Snipe could kill him. As it was, he wouldn't have the self-restraint to keep the first one from going into Tamura's skull. Before they vanished, he passed one last message along to the heroes. "Your students will face many other challenges from this group. I cannot prepare you for more." Before anyone could give him instructions, Deku retired to his room and logged back into the class, yanking off his helmet. The students were provided with earpieces, and without the communication blocker, it wouldn't seem suspicious that he was only speaking now. Just to be certain, he double and triple checked that his voice changer was working okay before putting on his headset. He wanted it different enough from Deku that they wouldn't find it too close. They were smart, sure, but hopefully the students wouldn't piece it together. "What happened?" his voice warbled. He hadn't yet pulled up the cameras on his desktop, which he was still waiting to turn on. His other devices blinked at him on the desk. His quirk was useless if the computer wasn't on. "All my cameras went dark. What's going on?" "Villains," a student replied breathlessly. The girl with the earphone quirk, if he remembered the voice correctly. How curious. He hadn't expected her to hold up that well. "They attacked the Usti." "Yeah, where were you, dude?" Another student cut in. It sounded like the blonde student he thought resembled a pro-hero he vaguely knew. Still need to look into that. "We could have used some help." "I couldn't reach you guys, dumbass. It's like the whole area went dark. I couldn't get anything until the heroes showed up." As he got louder, he could hear the pitching of the computer voice effect getting more varied and infrequent. Of course, he had to play the part, fall into the role of a distressed student who had no clue what happened. He still didn't have a visual, but didn't dive into cyberspace. What he needed was marked on his computer. Anyway, the cameras were too easy to access. He signed in as quickly as he could to go find it. "They just came on. I just see people everywhere. How'd they get in?" "Some portal quirk." That was from the creative girl, the recommendation student, calm and level-headed. So she was good under pressure, and well thought. She'd make a formidable foe if left unchecked, but he didn't know enough to make assumptions. They teleported into the Usti, but the leaders got away. So she did recognize Deku as a leader rather than a useful subordinate. Interesting. I'm not seeing traces of anyone else on campus, he said, briefly taking a moment to look through some of the cameras. Just a bunch of heroes apprehending people in the AuthorRei. All other locations appear safe. It was the truth. The Namu was God knows where, and the other villains hadn't breached the rest of the campus. For a second, he removed an ear from his headset, listening out to the rest of the base. They'd be focused for a while on Tamira, so he should be okay to keep talking with the class without interruptions. They needed his absolute focus, his full attention. These were people he had little experience with, and who could bring about his downfall in an instant. He couldn't afford any attention drawn to himself. Luckily, it didn't seem like anybody was approaching his room. He shifted the headset back over his ear. Confirmed, nobody else on campus. I don't see any portal quirks or anything, unless it's hidden. Can you describe them to me so I know what I'm looking for? I can look around the city if the quirk doesn't teleport long range. There was brief static and some odd shuffling. The list of earpieces seemed to fluctuate as some students pulled them off. Then another voice came over the line. Izumura, can you hear me? Present mic. He must have taken an earpiece either from Aizawa or the students. Perhaps he was in charge of the class in Eraserhead's absence, though he didn't quite like the hero using his first name. Yes, he confirmed. It would do well for him to listen to instructions, like a good student. To fight back would draw suspicion. To disobey could mean people looking into his hastily crafted backstory with a more scrutinizing eye. He had no other choice. Scan the area for people out of place. Look for those carrying support items or hanging out in groups. One is severely injured in his arms and legs. We will look through nearby hospitals, but if you can, you should search as your quirk allows. Deku was almost taken aback. He'd never heard Present Mike speak in such a manner. Usually, his laid-back nature carried into high-stress environments, even if he spoke a little more seriously. There wasn't even the hint of a nickname that the hero so often used with his students or fans, which meant he saw the situation as dire. He'd underestimated the hero. He'd misjudged him. Wow, he might be losing his touch. Will do, sensei, he answered calmly. That was the best way to handle this. Do as he's told, keep his head down, and don't draw too much attention. And one more thing. Principal Nezu. When had he logged into the call? He didn't recall being informed that the principal would have an earpiece as well, though he hadn't exactly paid attention to what earpieces were online. Like Mike, he'd likely taken one from a student that wasn't listening to him. What is it? More shuffling. Then, quietly, the other students and teachers cannot hear you. I would very much like to know your connection to Tamura Shigaraki. He didn't quite sound angry, but Izuku knew he had to be. Shit. He should have known it would come to this. He knew that the others would assume, especially after Kachon's display, that Deku was Izuku Midoriya, a quirkless boy with insane talent. Izumura Shigaraki, their classmate of only a couple of days, had a quirk that all the teachers and staff were witness to. But someone appearing who had it out for the heroes, who shared the same name, who could have met with the Hacker Deku, was too much of a coincidence. I do not know him, he lied easily. But that wouldn't be enough. Someone with his kind of quirk would have easily run into Deku online. However, I know of him. I see. Nezu's voice was soft. And how did you hear of him? This was it. He tapped his fingers against his keys, contemplating a response. He could lie again, say he had happened upon him on the streets, or heard the name at one of the vigilante cafes. But that would raise too many questions that he did not have answers to, and between one moment and the next everything he'd carefully built up would vanish. If it was any consolation, at least they wouldn't find him, no matter how much he knew. He didn't have safe houses, but he had places and people he could turn to should the League be exposed. Through Deku. He swallowed. The principal was silent for a moment. Very well. I shall contact Deku and set up an appointment to speak with him. Deku's mouth was dry. You can do that. I believe you already know that answer, Midoriya. Without any other word, Izumura ended the connection, knowing it was basically proving the principal right. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling. A hand came up, and he yanked off his headphones, staring as if the lights above his head would give him answers. They, of course, had none for him. He'd been found out. He'd been too lenient, too loose-lipped. They'd discovered him, his affiliations. They might know his goals, might know his weaknesses, might get to his mom. He couldn't allow that. Wouldn't allow that. Nezu would alert the heroes to what he'd figured out, and then he was done. League be damned. And even if they didn't get to him, couldn't actually catch him with their incompetent heroes, his reputation would be ground into dust and scattered to the wind. People wouldn't deal with a child who couldn't even keep his identity from being discovered. And his enemies would target his family and anyone associated with him. It would be chaos. And the public would finally become truly aware of him. He'd always been lurking just barely in the shadows, enough for rumors to spread, but nothing concrete to be known. They knew he was ruthless, and that was it. He always had the best data, the most accurate information on the market. He was second to none, and he knew it. If it got out that he was a kid, if it got out who his family was, she'd be killed by one of many of his enemies before he had the chance to get to her. His only hope was Nezu. Unlike the others, Nezu wasn't too keen on sharing information. Their one in-person interaction had proved that enough, as the heroes didn't even realize he was on campus. They knew that they'd had contact, of course, but didn't seem to know anything else about him. Nothing that he managed to pick up on, at least. Maybe that was the best course of action. Listen to Nezu, make whatever deals he wanted, and keep it at that, so his identity would be safe. The other weak link was Kachon. Kachon knew who he was. Calling himself Deku was a dead giveaway. He had to threaten him, somehow, into staying silent. He couldn't let Kachon know he'd gotten the better of Deku. They weren't kids anymore. This was real, with real stakes at play. He had to either threaten his silence or buy it, and he knew that wouldn't work. Kachon never had been motivated by money. Deku should contact him, send him a few messages that nobody else could understand, and keep his silence. Threaten his parents, who he cared deeply for even if he'd never admit it. Maybe release some information about how he treated the quirkless kids in school, and hope that it would discredit whatever he had to say about Izuku Midoriya. Regardless of how he moved forward, he had to send a message. Cover his tracks, like he always did. That was something he seemed to be forgetting. Maybe the supposed safety of the League really was getting to him. Before he'd had powerful backing, he was forced to use heroes or pay small-time mob bosses to go and dish out a beating to those that crossed him. Now, he had the reputation that kept his clients in line, and the threat of the League was a substantial one. Getting into the country's #1 hero school would be respectful to any villain worth their salt. He let out a breath and relaxed some of the tension in his shoulders. Calming down was good. If he lost his head now, he wouldn't be able to fix his mistakes. It would just take a little bit of effort, but he could fix it. Things weren't ruined just yet. Turning back to his monitor, he pulled up messages and typed in the phone number that he'd had memorized for years. When you're not busy, Kachon, we need to talk. There. That should be innocuous enough that any heroes or police he was nearby wouldn't question it. They wouldn't be able to trace the source in the event that it was under suspicion, and he very much doubted that the police would demand to search the students' phones. That should be enough to cover his ass, but he could monitor the situation as it unfolded. The police, no matter how many times they noticed him, hadn't managed to upgrade their systems enough to lock him out. Sighing again, Izumura slumped in his chair. He had to trust, however much he hated that. He had to trust the heroes and their stupidity, trust that Kachon would take his threats seriously. He needed a distraction. 5 minutes later, he was out the door, backpack slung over his shoulder and phone in his hand, walking up the fire escape of an apartment building nearby. The others were all distracted, so slipping out unnoticed wasn't much of a hassle. He didn't bother with his usual caution. The heroes were busy at the school, miles away, and if anyone spotted him, it wasn't like it mattered at this point. Surveillance always relaxed him. Since he'd obtained his quirk, he'd usually keep to his room, with the cameras he hacked into or the ones he planted himself. But being out and about once in a while wasn't a bad thing, and it was exactly what he needed. The fresh air was nice, once in a while, especially when the amount of time inside had long made his skin go pale and ashen. Sunlight wasn't exactly something he worried about when he was working. Maybe some heroes would be available for him to observe, in person, like he used to be, back when life was more simple, and he didn't have to look over his shoulder constantly. Back before people knew who he was. Back when it was just him, looking after his mom, paying the bills, making his own food, skipping school to go watch a fight, then going home instead because he got a little too close and had to wrap his injuries. He never went to the hospital. Not for himself, at any rate. He'd gone to visit his mom, but never for his burns or the various scratches he got from wreckage falling nearby. Looking after them was always a quick internet search away. He had the money and the means to get what he needed. Why did he need anything else? Why should he turn to someone else when the rest of society turned their backs on him? The rooftops, like usual, were quiet. A small breeze blew his bangs into his face, and he brushed them away, only mildly annoyed. They were overgrown. He'd learned to cut his hair a while back, but he was never particularly good at it. Months of neglect left it constantly in his eyes, and he'd never gathered the courage to go get it cut. Staying in one place for almost an hour, out in public, unnerved him, more than he liked to admit. In an open space, where people could see what he looked like, and potentially recognize him. Where, if the police got a heads up, he'd be waiting, and unable to run if he got surrounded. At least on the subway he was surrounded by technology he could make go haywire. Here, there wasn't much of that, aside from his phone, and he doubted the camera network nearby was too extensive, so he wouldn't even be able to track them. He wouldn't even be able to use his quirk, because he had to stay alert, like a trapped rat. He banished the thought as he traversed through the city, hunkering down if he saw a hero who could have seen him, and moved slowly. He followed those he saw, getting into their calms and letting the stream of chatter reach his ears. That felt nice, relaxing, as if he could breathe. Deku yanked off his helmet at some point and settled down on a rooftop. He didn't pull out his laptop. Instead, he just remained and watched, just existing, which was something he rarely got to do. It occurred to him, then, that the detective might have been telling him the truth. There could be a life for him outside of the league, where he'd be able to have more moments like this and not stress enough to be worried about his hair going white, where he might, at some point, have a friend. But just as quickly, something dark and foreboding banished the thought away immediately. He was startled, unrecognizing of what it was. What had gotten into him? What had taken him over? It closed up his throat, making him choke on empty words, gripping at his mind and slowly tugging at it to make the idea go away. The presence, or whatever it was enough to make any thought of running retreat, at least for now. When it relented, he was left reeling, staring at the cars moving on the street below, passerby walking idly on either side. Not for the first time he wondered if he'd even be missed. 2 days later, Deku wandered into Tomura's room down the hall. "You alive in here?" he called out, hanging in the doorframe. "F you," was the response, but Tomura said nothing else, staring up at the ceiling. He really must have been feeling the pain. Usually he'd have cussed Deku out for not warning him, even though he most definitely did. Izumura perched on the edge of the bed for a moment. "Good. I'm glad you're not dead. Feel like shit, though. That tends to be what happens when you get shot." Deku looked away, at the bare walls. For once, it seemed like his usual posters and comics were gone. "Not like you'd know anything," said Tomura. "You'd be surprised." And it seemed like he had no response. That night, he received an email from Nezu while drafting another for the hero killer. He'd obtained some data during his week away from school that he figured his partner might be interested in, though Deku himself barely glanced at it. It wasn't anything particularly useful, at least not to him. Most locations and data he received wasn't noted down. He knew how to find them again anyway. Opening the message, though, revealed that the principal was careful. It named a date and a time, but no names, no trace. Deku would have gone crazy trying to wipe the data if it included his name, like he'd been called over the radio frequency. That wasn't too secure either, but at least UA had their own systems and couldn't be monitored by outside influences. That meant the police couldn't access it. Email, like everything else online, was easy for him to get into. At least this would be all right. The date listed was only the next day. Nezu must have been sure he'd read it quickly. It was also at night, too, so his suit would be useful to hide. He didn't doubt that Yua would be careful, but when the students were away and only the teachers remained, it'd be very dangerous for him. If it was a trap, he'd walk right into it. Yet at the same time, he didn't feel like informing Kurogiri. If he was caught, well, that was it. At least it would be the US staff, not the other heroes who might have it out for him. Like an idiot, he decided to go. The base was still hectic, and security was increased. Yet the next day he didn't have any trouble slipping out unnoticed. He'd thrown a hoodie over the top of his suit to hopefully hide it from any heroes he might run into, and his helmet was tucked away in his backpack. With any luck, he'd look like any other normal teenager, running around to find a spot to do homework. Without incident, he made his way to the subway. There were several police officers around that he had to stand by for a few minutes in the crowd, but they didn't notice him. He eavesdropped for a bit, but the subject of conversation was nothing of consequence, as usual. They didn't even seem concerned with the UA invasion only a few miles away. Typical. No matter how much trouble they cause, new villains pop up daily. They're only concerned with their city. Not that he really blamed them. They were only assigned to one city. It wasn't his problem to deal with, and it never was his concern. He worked for their problems, after all. But if they knew who he was, he did think they'd be a little more cautious. Unlike the last time he found himself on a train, there was no All Might here to mess with. He didn't think he would have. All Might must be recovering or putting together lesson plans at UA, the direction he was headed in. Again, he wondered if this was a trap and dismissed it. He had fail-safes. He would be fine. The information he carried, if it came down to it, could be released and spread across the internet. Deku would rip open the canvas painting of Hero Society and reveal the stains underneath, and leave the commission to patch up the gaps, if they even could. If he was walking into an ambush, their lives would be ripped apart in front of their eyes. This was one of the few times Deku didn't really like having that power. Along with a couple other passengers, he got off at the stop closest to UA, following the crowd. There was a large shopping mall in town that he assumed most of them were headed to, and it would drop suspicion if he appeared to be doing the same. He followed them for a little while, just a few blocks away from the subway, before breaking off to hide in some alleyway. There were many more police stationed here. He had to be more careful, especially now that they could recognize his suit. The more recognizable things were hidden away, but he still couldn't take chances when his usual fallback didn't even know he was out here. Without a combat quirk, a conflict wouldn't end in his favor, even if he could get to his knife. The police had guns. A knife wouldn't do much against bullets. The rest of the way was basically a hike. He blended in where he could and tried to seem unassuming, which luckily wasn't difficult. He'd always had a relatively plain-looking face. Most of the path to UA had a lot of traffic, so he simply moved along, skipping past cops and the occasional hero, which lessened the closer to UA he got. He'd assumed it would be the opposite, but it worked in his favor. Outside of its walls was a small forest, so he ducked in there the first moment he could. Hound Dog, the school lifestyle guidance counselor, often patrolled the area, so Deku had to move quickly. He ditched his backpack and the hoodie a short distance from the walls, still in the tree's shadow, and put on his helmet. Even though his sensors didn't detect quirked presences nearby, he still kept a hand on his knife and crept forward, eyes and ears strained for movement. Going in through the front gate was about the dumbest move he could make, but he'd be able to influence it enough to get it to open with his quirk. He could also scale the walls, like he'd done before, but Nezu might be expecting that. Though he knew he'd likely run into at least one hero before getting to Nezu's office, he hoped it wouldn't be so soon after getting inside. He took a deep breath. One aspect of his suit held both a cloaking and a holographic feature that could keep him hidden. He'd tested it before, without much luck, since his sensors still picked him up easily enough. But maybe it was enough to cloak him as another hero, or perhaps camouflage him so that the teachers couldn't see him. On his fingers, he started listing off the pro heroes who worked at UA. The ones that could possibly detect him, Ectoplasm and Power Loader, didn't work in the heroics department. Power Loader, however, was a technology developer and could possibly have sensors that would pick him up. Ectoplasm he wasn't completely sure of, as he had limited knowledge of the fog that made clones and how much he could detect with it. Even so, he could make at least a dozen copies of himself to patrol, and while the others couldn't tell with their quirks, decades of experience might be enough for them. Screw it. He could attempt the cloaking, at least, and then make it through the gate. It didn't take long to activate, either, and it would last until he could make it inside. That should be enough, and part of his quirk entailed a temporary power source, so he may even be able to give it enough power to get out, if it worked. His thoughts once again strayed to the staff. Hound Dog could possibly sniff him out, but he could get away before the hero picked up the scent. Even then, he might think it's just a student, but Deku didn't get his hopes up. Hound Dog might be impulsive, but he wasn't an idiot. Like most of the heroes here, he had plenty of experience hunting villains. Once he approached the gate, though, he was a little unnerved to find it locked, but easily accessible. The gate was practically allowing him in without even doing anything. It was programmed to let students and identified visitors through, but they had to have a special ID to allow them entry. He looked once more to confirm that his suit still had him cloaked, then up at the cameras. Surely they had infrared and could see him. Scrambling the rest of it took less than a second, a short enough time that hopefully any cameras wouldn't show a shift in his balance. He'd heard that they upgraded it in the wake of the invasion, but it didn't appear to show. Maybe Nezu had most of the restrictions bypassed for him. He moved past without a second thought. The gate closed behind him, but he didn't hear a lock click. There was his escape route. Deku knew where Nezu's office was. He also knew that Nezu wanted him to meet in a conference room, not his office, which lacked most forms of technology besides a computer or two. There weren't even any cameras in there, but a quick check confirmed that Nezu was indeed in the conference room specified. Alone, thankfully. But as he walked towards it, cursing the sound his shoes made, he found the school deserted. No heroes, no staff, not even cleaners, which he expected. Had Nezu made them all go home in wake of his arrival? Did he hold that much faith that Deku wouldn't attack or do anything malicious? Soon enough, he reached the room. A voice called out from inside. "Come in." Steeling himself, he deactivated his cloak and opened it. A wall of windows on the opposite side greeted him. "Excuse me," he said, out of old habit, and stepped inside with squared shoulders and head held high. Nezu sat at the head of the table on the far side of the room, with a light smile on his face and a folder set delicately in front of him. "Good evening, Deku," he greeted, as Izuku closed the door behind him and settled about halfway down the table far enough away from the door and Nezu, if he tried something. "Good evening," Deku returned, voice warping. He should have checked that before he left the base. Already he did maintenance every time he went out. It should be included on his checklist by now. "What do you want?" He was being rude, he knew, but he wanted this to be quick. In and out, before any lingering hero could pick up that the gate was unlocked. The principal leaned forward. "Who are you working for?" Nezu asked, the smile immediately receding. "And what do they give you?" So Nezu desired him on their side. He suspected it from the start, but it was good to have confirmation. If he wanted out of the league, he would have gone already. They didn't ask much from him, and they gave him much. I work for myself, Principal. I'm sure you know that many of my clients over the last several months have been heroes. He set his arms on the table, clasping his hands in front. And as for what I get out of it, it varies. Favors or protection from certain organizations are worth more to me than a few million yen. And I do not trust you heroes for favors, so money or information will suffice. He was giving out too much information too freely, he knew, but for once he didn't care. If Nezu wanted to buy his services more than he already was, he'd need more incentive than money. The principal was smart enough. He'd figure it out on his own. And no matter what Nezu offered, he knew he couldn't switch sides. The league was his safety, and they promised him a quirk in exchange for his services. They had delivered. It was his turn now. And not only that, but there was something much more precious that they would take if he abandoned them. I see. Then, who is your current client, Deku? I can't divulge that information, he said, almost too quickly. You know that. But you have, Nezu said, gesturing to the folder in front of him. You gave All Might a cipher. It was a fairly simple one, and probably one you came up with on the spot. It took a moment to decode, but I got it. You're working for All for One, yes? No, Deku said, knowing that the principal could tll it was a lie. He gave you a quirk in exchange for working with him. I'm quirkless, as I know you're aware. We're quirkless, Nezu corrected, because of course he did. Money doesn't sway you too much, no matter how you pretend otherwise. That means they must have something else that you want. Like I told you, my clients offer protection. But if you were after a quirk, then you wouldn't be contacting us, would you? You must have it already and be working towards paying it off. I'm quirkless. Yet there's something else keeping you there. Some kind of threat, if they're targeting you or your mother. That's it. Deku slammed his hand on the table. You know who I am already. That I could care less about, because Izuku Midoriya is dead. However, I took up what I do for the health and safety of my mother, and as long as I'm still here, she's protected by me. No matter what you heroes offer me or her, know this, we are perfectly fine without your intervention. And if you really wish for my well-being, as well as the well-being of civilians, you'll stay out of it entirely. He paused and settled back in his chair. That was out of line, and I'm not here to discuss this, so what do you want? With that, Nezu coughed politely. He almost seemed to be expecting the outburst. His paws settled back on the file. I apologize. I'm sure that's enough for you, yes? But his voice wasn't directed at Deku. Almost alarmingly quickly, he figured out what was going on. Right as the UA teachers were coming through the door. Heroes. Izuku jumped to his feet, a hand immediately flying to his knife. How? I didn't see anyone, no, you lied to me. He scanned the heroes quickly. Midnight, Ectoplasm, Vlad King, Eraserhead, Cementos. No All Might. None of their quirks were active, yet they were all on guard. The principal got to his feet, and his attention snapped back over to him. I brought them here because I would like you to see that we will not harm you, Midoriya, and they would like to know what your motives are. If you attempt to run, they will bring you back, yes, but if you work with us, you will be safe. You will not be reported to the Hero Commission, and whatever hold All for One has over you, we can help you remove it. No, he said immediately. You don't know anything. I don't believe in you heroes, and I know you. You'll go back on your word in an instant. He should have known that he shouldn't trust these heroes. There was no hero he would be able to trust, and yet he decided to listen to one, and see where that got him. All those years ago, he trusted All Might, and that got him nowhere. He'd trusted a hero with the most raw, earnest part of himself, and it had been crushed into a million little pieces. Only recently had he been trying to pick those shards up and glue himself back together, but now the fragile seams had broken again. You're just like villains, you know that? You lie, cheat, and exploit what I told you in confidence, Nezu, just so I'd let my guard down. Do you feel proud of yourself? That you brought the Hacker Deku down? The patient, understanding look on Nezu's face was infuriating. The animal knew, he knew, and that had been Deku's undoing. Tell me, he pulled his knife, pointing it at the principal. You won't get anything about my clients from me, so you might as well stop asking. I'll die before I tell you. The words came out of his mouth, but he floundered, almost detached from his line of reasoning. When had he become this protective of the League? People who care nothing for him? He'd never done this before. This wasn't like him. What was going on? Midoriya, Midnight started, but he cut her off immediately. No, you don't get to call me that. Shut up, shut up. He pointed the knife at her, acutely aware of the tears blurring his vision. You don't get to try and treat me like I'm somebody when it's already too late. If you wanted a chance, you should have taken All Might's place years ago when he told me that I couldn't do anything. The data, he reminded himself, chest heaving and breath shallow. He had the data he could release. Without Eraserhead's quirk activated, he could upload that data to the internet and get it spread to every news platform out there. He could do that. With any luck, the heroes would think he passed out. He could end them. But that young kid part of him refused. What did the commission tell you about me, huh? What orders were you given? Deku. His vision refocused. He had backed away, almost to the windows, and Nezu stood on top of the table in front of him. The chairs were pushed away from where he'd been sitting. He hadn't noticed that he stumbled away. Whether you believe me or not, we do not wish to harm you or bring you to the police. The Commission has agreed not to do anything as long as you do not interfere and release data that they hold. And what if I say no? Then we let you leave, Nezu said plainly. But be aware that the next time we meet, it will not be as friends. Deku laughed, almost psychotic. You expect me to believe that he hadn't even realized that the knife was pulled back, close to his chest. He didn't do that. I didn't do that. The knife was raised by his own hand, up to his neck. I didn't do that. Midoriya, someone yelled. But I did. Eraserhead's capture cloth was around his arm in an instant, pulling his hand away. A hero, he didn't know which one, was at his side, restraining him. When did that happen? What was going on? Seconds later, he was on the floor, gasping for air. His vision wasn't obscured by sensors anymore, and it felt like fresh, clean air was entering his lungs. His vision was blurry. A figure knelt above him, with a hand on his chest. Deku closed his eyes. He felt warm. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Hacker Deku Joined League of Villains. I hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. A big shout out to AuthorRei for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile on Archive of Our Own for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to What If Deku 2.0 for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we're always excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you guys in the next video.